Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Cathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakare, Chatman,
and me, Tova, Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America.
Welcome to Constitutional Chats with me, Janine Turner, Cathy Gillespie, Tova Kaplan, and Dakare Chatman. And tonight our hot topic is mail-in voting. And our special guest is John Fund. And we're so excited to have him. National Affairs columnist for National Review. And I'm going to read all of his bio in just a minute. But first I will say hi, I'm Janine Turner. I am founder and co-president of Constituting America. We do many amazing things. Please check it all out at constitutingamerica.org. I'm also an actress. You can check all that out at janineturner.com. And Cathy Gillespie, we are co-presidents. Without Cathy, I'd be like, they say it takes a right wing and a left wing to fly. An eagle takes a right wing and a left wing to fly. If it were not for Cathy, I would just be flapping around with all my ideas and we would not be airborne. So Cathy Gillespie. I'll introduce Cathy and then she can say hello. But Cathy Gillespie is not only my dear, most wonderful friend on the planet, but she is quite accomplished. She was a chief of staff on the Hill for decades, and she is now one of the prestigious 16 people chosen to be the chair and the great foresight of planning for the Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which is planning the 250th birthday of our country, the Declaration of Independence. So, and co-president of Constituting America, where would we be without Cathy? Cathy, say hello.
Hi, everybody. We're glad that you're here.
We are glad that you're here, Cathy. Okay, Tova Love Kaplan. Y'all are going to be so impressed tonight. We have two just brilliant, truly brilliant 16-year-old students who are part of the show. They help plan it. They help promote it. Everything is a group effort on this show. And Tova Love Kaplan is 16 years old. She lives in Illinois. She currently serves as in the coveted role of our National Youth Director for Constituting America. And she runs the National Youth Advisory Council, and I always like to brag on her and say she does it just as wonderfully as a CEO of a major corporation, truly. She is a 3-time winner of our We the Future contest. She won in middle school for entrepreneurial category where she created a marketing plan. Then she won for PSA last year, Know Your Rights, Read the Constitution, where she created, wrote, directed, starred, edited, produced, did everything with her own public service announcement, which is like a commercial, 30-second commercial. And STEM, this year she won for STEM, where she created an app. So we're going to get that up and running. We're very excited to have that at Constituting America. She's passionate about educating and empowering young people to use their constitutional rights. Welcome to Love Kaplan. Say hello.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here, and thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, and now the equally so amazingly brilliant Dakare Chatman. Dakare Chatman, did you say you were 17 years old the other day? Dakare, have you had a birthday?
Yes, ma'am.
Dakare. Oh, when was your birthday?
January.
Well, wow. I've been saying you're 16 this whole time, but you're really 17?
It's fine.
Dakare is 17 years old. I've been saying he's 16 forever. Well, happy belated birthday. He's a student ambassador for Constituting America. He's currently a junior full-time college student in South Carolina as a 16, 17-year-old. Imagine that. He has won Constituting America's We the Future contest twice. Once for PSA, we talked about that, a short 30-second, 60-second commercial, where he reminded viewers the Constitution is an American thing, so know it. And twice for his short film, well, twice, he won again, for his short film, Man on the Street, wonderful short film as well. He won for that this past year. You can see all of these brilliant young adults works at constitutingamerica.org. He is also actively involved in our National Youth Advisory Board, and he's a working actor, seen most recently in HBO's The Righteous Gemstones and also Outer Banks that was recently released on Netflix. Dakare wishes to be an actor, but also a politician, but he believes you need to be an actor to be a politician. Welcome, Dakare Chatman.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And we all know that the Constitution is an American thing, so we must learn it and know it. So I hope you guys enjoy it.
Right. Just like your billboard says, Dakare.
Yes, ma'am.
And we love that hat. Yeah, just like that billboard. Okay. As I said, our hot topic tonight is mail-in voting, and our special constitutional scholar is John Fund. I'm going to introduce him and tell you some great things, and he can say hello and start educating us about this very, very hot topic. Okay, so he is a writer. He's a national affairs columnist for National Review. And John Fund is an American political journalist and conservative columnist who is currently the national affairs columnist for National Review Online and senior editor at the American Spectator. Roll Call, the newspaper of Capitol Hill, called him, quote, the Tom Paine of the modern congressional reform movement, end quote. He has won awards from the Institute for Justice, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and the Fund for American Studies. John is the author of a book we all must don't walk to buy. Several books, including Stealing Elections, How Voter Fraud Threatens Our Democracy, and Who's Counting, How Fraudsters, look at that word, fraudsters, and bureaucrats put your vote at risk. John is considered to be a notable expert on American politics and the nexus between politics and economics. For the last decade, John has written in the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, American Spectator, and other publications. He's made over 90 appearances on Fox News, MSNBC, C-SPAN, and CNBC. Welcome, John Fund.
Well, I'm very pleased to help out with Janine's group. Janine and Cathy and her team are doing a wonderful job acquainting Americans and young people with our Constitution. And the reason that we need to do that was brought home to me today when I looked back on Ronald Reagan's farewell address, which was in 1989, before almost everyone on this broadcast, I suspect, was born. And it was a very optimistic address, as Reagan was, but he left with one warning. He warned all of us that we were losing touch with our traditions, our values, and our principles as a country. We were not communicating that to the next generation. And he told us that liberty is something you cannot transmit through the bloodstream. You cannot pass it down to people. It must be communicated from one generation to the next. And of course, the cornerstone of our liberty is the Constitution. And what we're discussing tonight is a vital part of that Constitution, which is the election process. This is probably one audience I don't need to remind that the Constitution gives the states the power to, quote, regulate the time, manner, and place, unquote, of elections. So we have a decentralized system. Unlike many countries that have a national election board or bureau, our 50 states operate our election systems. And that's generally a good thing. It makes it much harder for a central authority to manipulate an election. It makes it very practical to handle the almost 1 million Americans who serve an elected office. This is astonishing. We're a nation of 330 million people. 1 million of us almost are elected to an office. Now, it may be dog catcher, it may be head of the sewer reclamation board, it may be the school board, but this shows the level of our participatory democracy. And that kind of local control is best handled with local control of elections. So now we come to the issue of mail-in voting. Absentee ballots, which are the form of mail-in voting we're used to, have been around since the Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln wanted to make sure the troops who were fighting could participate in the election we held without any delays during the Civil War. But since then, it's been expanded from the military to people who have a legitimate, understandable reason why they want to vote absentee, people who are in nursing homes, people who are traveling outside of their district, people who live overseas, people who are bedridden. And of course, in this time of virus, it will also include some people who have pre-existing conditions and are very vulnerable and don't want to get out of the house. But until very recently, absentee ballots were 5% of voters, 10% of voters. Recently, some states have moved to basically all absentee or all mail-in voting. And now we're up to between 23 and 26% in the last election voted absentee or voted early, which is different from absentee. It means you go down to an election office before the election and you stand in line and you vote there. So it's like voting at the polling place, but it's voting before election day. Well, obviously the virus has created a great debate about how to handle voting in this election, which is only 150 days away. And basically, we have two camps of people arguing about this. One says, well, you know, we can't do elections the old-fashioned way. We're going to have to reinvent everything because the virus has changed everything. And what we're going to do, and Nancy Pelosi wanted to do this on the national level, but it didn't get into any of the stimulus bills. So this is all being decided state by state. What we're going to do is we're going to basically have a national mail ballot. And what this means, for example, in California, every single person who's on the voter registration rolls will be mailed a ballot, even if they don't ask for it. And the ballot will be sent out and it will come back. And if it's been postmarked on even on election day, when it comes in 3 or 8 days later or more in the mail, it still will be counted. And they say this is the only way we're going to ensure that everyone has the right to vote. People who are skeptical of that say, well, of course we're going to have to make accommodations because of the virus. And of course more people will be voting absentee and voting early. But the time is too short to completely upend, turn over our entire election system and deliver it to the US Postal Service, which I don't need to remind you, or perhaps I do because many of you probably don't use the Postal Service very much, is not the most efficient of government organizations. And the skepticism is, I think, valid. A Gallup poll recently asked Americans how much confidence they had in the honesty of elections. Only 40% of Americans said they had much confidence in election honesty. 60% said no. And the reason for that is that in 2005, we had former President Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, and former Secretary of State James Baker, a Republican, were asked to look at every aspect of our election process and make recommendations for reforms. This is after the Florida recount that exposed the vulnerability of many of our state election systems to complications. And this commission was very important because it was one of the last bipartisan efforts we had in this area. And what they concluded is, in the area of mail-in voting, quote, absentee ballots are the single largest source of potential voter fraud. Absentee balloting is vulnerable to abuse in several ways. Blank ballots mailed to the wrong address or to large residential buildings might get interrupted. Ballots can be stolen from mailboxes. Citizens who vote at home, at nursing homes, at the workplace, or in church are more susceptible to pressure, overt and subtle, or to intimidation. Vote buying schemes are far more difficult to detect when citizens vote by mail. So while vote by mail is very convenient for many people, it does carry some costs with it. For one thing, one of the constitutional rights that have been developed over the years is a secret ballot. No one can find out how you voted. That's between you and your conscience. But a mail-in ballot changes that, because if the ballot is floating around, there's an awful lot of temptation for people to want to help you with your ballot. And we have seen, and especially in states like Texas and California, we have vote harvesters. And what these are people who go door to door. They're often paid by campaigns, so they have a partisan interest in this. And they say, we know you got your ballot, because this is public information if you request an absentee ballot. We'll help you with it. Do you need any help having questions answered about who's on the ballot? Maybe we can have some suggestions, and we'll deliver your ballot for free. You don't have to put a stamp on it. And it used to be that in almost all states, you could only handle someone else's ballot if you were a relative of theirs or someone who had been given specific permission to handle and carry the ballot. In some states like California, that has been completely done away with, and people can now transport hundreds of ballots, gather them up and deliver them. And of course, there are all kinds of problems that can develop in that situation. For example, if you're going to a neighborhood and collecting ballots and you think that, well, some of these ballots are probably cast for the candidate I'm not in favor of, you can lose those ballots. And frankly, no one's going to detect that or catch that. There are other things that can happen. Ballots can be opened. Ballots can be manipulated. And of course, there's intimidation, as we mentioned earlier. So moving forward to my conclusion, I think that we can have expanded access to the polls. We should allow more absentee voting and more early voting, which is more secure than absentee voting because it takes place in a government building. And we need to keep safeguards, because what's also happening with this proposal to mail everyone who's on the registration rolls a ballot is the first problem. The Pew Research Center, which is a very good nonpartisan organization, says 1 out of 7 registrations are either invalid, inaccurate, represent people who've moved away, people who are dead, people who never existed. And those ballots, if they're swirling around, millions of them, can create a potential pool of mischief. And so then they also want to propose doing away with certain protections many states have. For example, some states require you to have a witness when you send in your absentee ballot. Somebody who says, I'm sitting next to them, I saw them sign the ballot, it's them, and they have to sign that. They want to do away with that and other protections that protect the integrity of the process. So all of this really is not just speculation. I'll give you 3 different examples recently of what can happen with these mail-in voting issues. In North Carolina, and this, by the way, shows that voter fraud is a bipartisan issue, a consultant who had worked for both Democratic and Republican candidates, but in this case was working for a Republican congressional candidate, in 2016, which is not that long ago, 2018, I'm sorry, 2018, which is only 2 years ago, 900 absentee ballots were sent through the mail, and it turned out that they were fraudulent. They had been filled out en masse using names that people had gathered from the voter registration rolls that the people decided would never be voting, so no one would catch it if somebody voted in their name. And this was so blatant that the election was overturned by a court and it had to be rerun. So the entire election was fraudulent and was declared so. The second case just happened 10 days ago in Paterson, New Jersey, which is not far from where I live in New York City. And there, 10% of the absentee ballots in the local city race were found to be fraudulent, were found to have been filled out by campaign workers or manipulated in some other way. And then the third example is we're in Texas, who had a United States Postal Service delivery person convicted and sent to prison because he had worked with a campaign in which he would go on his route in his truck and he would know which ballots, which houses had ballots delivered to them, because all the ballots are mailed basically at the same time. So then he would signal someone, well, I've delivered ballots to this house, this house, this house, and this house, and I just finished my route. So then someone went around to all of those houses in the mailboxes and took the ballot. And we don't know for sure what happened, but I suspect they wanted to take the ballot and they didn't have good intentions with that ballot. And those are just 3 examples that came up in very recent history. So to conclude, I'm in favor of absentee voting. I'm in favor of people voting by mail. I'm in favor of early voting. But as you know in life, too much of anything can be a bad thing if it's carried to excess. And I would just remind people in closing that the Constitution, as we currently interpret it, guarantees people 2 fundamental civil rights when it comes to voting. the first right, and we fought a civil rights struggle in the 1960s, and we still need to fight that struggle, and we still need to extend the gains that we made in the 1960s. We have a fundamental right to vote. And in the 1960s, there were places where people weren't allowed to vote. There were property qualifications, there were literacy tests, there were other barriers to voting. And we swept those away, and we have to maintain eternal vigilance to make sure that no one is ever prevented from voting. But there's also a second constitutional right, which is the right not to have your ballot or the ballot of your parents canceled out, invalidated by someone who's voting who shouldn't be voting, whether it's someone who's voting in the name of a dead person, or someone who is voting in the name of someone who's moved out of state, or someone who's invented a name. I mean, I know that's hard to believe, but God and Jesus are registered to vote in California. Jesus is a Democrat and God is a Republican. You can make whatever you want of that. And we don't want our votes invalidated, because you can lose your vote in one of two ways. You can be prevented from voting, and you can also have your vote canceled out by someone whose voting basically invalidates your vote. So we want to prevent both. In other words, we want to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And this is America. I think we can do both.
Well said. Okay, where to begin? I have so many questions. I'm going to go first, and then we will we'll all ask our questions. Wow. Okay. I'm going to ask an elementary question first, and then we should do two questions at a time. First of all, the voting is decided on a local basis, how people vote.
The rules
what's being proposed
are all done at the local level.
The rules and accounting are done at a local level. Okay. So what did you say?
I said nothing.
John?
I said nothing. The rules, okay. The states basically advise and help guide the counties. Almost all of the counting and the rules are done at the county level. Some of the rules are state level. We have secretaries of state in the states. They basically act as an umbrella organization helping the county election officials. The actual running of the elections and the actual counting of the ballots is done at the county or at the city level.
Okay, so what Nancy Pelosi is proposing is a federal decision. Is that what's happening here? She federally wants to say.
Congress does allow the Constitution does allow Congress to override the states. So if Congress wants to say, we don't like the way you're running an election, we're going to insist on something different, they have that power. That's not going to happen this year because the Pelosi proposal didn't make it into any of the bills, and of course the president would veto that. So we're dealing with efforts at the state level to try to reinvent the election system, and in some states go to all mail voting, and in some states to make other less dramatic changes.
Okay, and so when you said you support absentee voting, and what was the other one you supported? Absentee voting and
early voting.
Early voting, right? But then you said you also back mail voting, but you don't mean general ballot. Everyone has to vote.
Just to get the definitions right, absentee voting is where you request a ballot in advance and they send it to you and you mail it back. All mail-in voting is everybody on the registration rolls gets a ballot automatically, even if they don't ask for it. That's all mail-in voting. Then there's early voting, where you can go down to a government office before the election, 1 week, 10 days in advance, and you can vote there rather than vote on election day at the polling place. And I favor versions of all three, but when it comes to all mail-in voting, where everybody gets a ballot, that is an open and engraved invitation to chaos, confusion, and mischief.
That would be really, really confusing, because you might actually show up at the ballot box and then you have, that just sounds really confusing.
Well, you also have a problem. You also have a problem. You have to have security. You know, our election workers, who, by the way, the average age is over 70, and I encourage the young people on this broadcast to consider, you know, your school might offer you credit if you work out and train as an election worker this fall. It's very confusing because if you blend in, if you mail everyone a ballot, you're still going to have some people who want to vote on election day in a polling place. So people will show up at the polling place and they may have already voted absentee. So you have to have a mechanism by which you can figure out, well, we can't have you vote now because you've already voted absentee. So some people may insist though, well, I don't remember voting absentee. So they're going to cast a provisional ballot, which means it's a ballot that's set aside and it's counted later and ruled valid or invalid at that point. Here's the problem with all of this. The one thing, you know, young people are the beneficiary of incredible changes in our life. Everything comes faster now. You can now order something from Amazon and have it arrive the next day. You can have instant gratification. You want a song on your music playlist, it can be there in 5 seconds. The one thing that has slowed down and is much slower than it used to be is figuring out who won an election. We used to open up something that was called a newspaper and we could learn the next morning who had won the election. Now, especially if ballots can be mailed in the day of the election and not received for 3 or 4 days. In California, we didn't know the results of 7 to 10 congressional districts in the last election for a week to 3 weeks after the election, depending on how close they were. So this creates mass confusion and unsettles people. And people do not need more doubts about the validity of our democracy and the legitimacy of our elections. We need to make things, well, what's the famous phrase, KISS? Keep it simple, stupid. So we need to make some adjustments for the virus, but we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater and start with a whole new system because since it's never been tried before, it would be very chaotic, very confusing, very controversial, and could lead to a crisis like we had in Florida in 2000, where people were fighting for weeks after the election and we didn't know who the president would be.
Yeah, I want to toss this to Tova, but also the one thing that we're assured that we're guaranteed is a private vote. And we walk in, we tell the person we're there, they check our name off, the election worker checks our name off, and then we go vote. And when I still vote by ballot up here in the country, which I wish we all still did ballot and we didn't do electronic voting anymore, but it's a whole other subject. But I have to fill out my ballot and I put it in the box. So when they read my ballot, they have no idea that I voted.
Your name is not on it.
My name's not on the ballot. Right. Now, if you have a mail-in vote, though,
Your name has
your name has to be on the ballot. So you no longer have a private vote. Am I correct in that assessment?
Yes, and in the vast majority of cases, that's no problem, but you are giving up your right to do that. The real problem is your ballot has escaped the scrutiny, the oversight of government officials. It's out there in the mail. So lots of things can happen to it. And once it reaches you, lots of things can happen. You know, there are places in this country where spouses will try to tell their spouse how to vote. Employers will try to tell people how to vote. Unions will try to tell people how to vote. People will go door to door and say, I want to help you fill out your ballot. I know you just got it today. There's all kinds of pressure, intimidation, and frankly, buying votes. People will say, if you show me your ballot and and it's voting for the right person, I'll give you $10, I'll give you $20, I'll give you $50.
Okay, right. Well, the point I was making is you lose your right to a private ballot too, because when you send your ballot in,
you are losing your right to the secret.
Okay, Tova, your question, Tova, go ahead.
Sure. So I was wondering, first of all, how big is voter fraud as a concept in general, regardless of the method? Like, is voter fraud a widespread enough problem that it, substantially changes the outcomes of elections? And then secondly, could you give us some more, specific statistics on how mail-in voting either increases or changes the statistics and prevalence of voting fraud? Because as you mentioned, there are now some states, I think there are 4 that do, mostly or primarily mail-in, 5, Lisa says, that do primarily mail-in or not in-person voting. And so now we have a natural experiment to see, does voting fraud increase in those states? So could you just provide us with some more statistics and then talk about, is that fraud enough of a discrepancy to actually change the outcome of elections?
Well, the people who say there's no problem with all mail voting say, well, there are very few cases of voter fraud. Well, the first thing is they almost always refer to federal cases. There are lots of, but prosecutions are done at the state and local level. And if you go to the Heritage Foundation's website, you will find hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of recent cases where people have not only been indicted for voter fraud, but been convicted. Secondly, the problem with voter fraud is a lot like insider trading in the stock market. We know there's a lot of insider trading in the stock market. We know we can't catch all of it. We try and indict people for it, but we don't know the scale of it. But that doesn't mean we get rid of the laws on insider trading. Voter fraud, we don't know the scale of voter fraud. It pops up, frankly, when people make a mistake, because it can be the perfect crime. I'll just give you an example, and this is not mail-in voting, but it just shows you how sloppy some of our systems can be. A gentleman named James O'Keefe, who's a guerrilla journalist who goes around and tries to expose government corruption with video cameras. A few years ago, he walked into a Washington, D.C. polling place, and he said, "Do you have the name of Eric Holder on your voting rolls?" Eric Holder was the Attorney General of the United States under Barack Obama. Now, he didn't say he was Eric Holder, and they said, "Oh, yes, here you are, here's your ballot." And of course, O'Keefe did not want to commit a crime, so he said, "Oh, no, I'm going to have to show you my ID." "Oh, we don't need ID, we don't do that here, we don't have ID." "Oh," he says, "well, I really think we should. I should show my ID. I'll go out in my car and I'll get it." And he left and he never came back. Well, they were willing to give him a man who was in his 20s, who was white, who had no resemblance whatsoever to Eric Holder, who's African American. And by the way, Eric Holder had been voting in that precinct for 40 years. So most of the people there had at least seen him at some point, and he was probably the most famous person in that precinct, but they still didn't figure it out. So with mail-in voting, if somebody intercepts your ballot, and let's say they steal it from the mailbox, like that case in Texas, they fill it out for you and send it in, how will you know that your ballot was stolen? No one's going to go and call up the election office and say, "Have you gotten my ballot? Did it get?" I mean, maybe a few people, and we've had some cases of that. We have had cases where people do show up to the polling place and people say, "You can't vote because you've already voted absentee." And they say, "But I never asked for an absentee ballot, but somebody filled it out in their name." So we don't have specific statistics, but we do have specific cases where elections have been overturned. The mayor of Miami a few years ago, the election was declared invalid and they had to have a new election, the congressional case in California. But let me give you the most, I think, compelling case. Because I think voter fraud happens most frequently in poor areas, areas with a not completely developed democratic system, one-party states, and it usually occurs in primaries. And often in inner cities and in rural backwater counties where there's a political machine. And let me tell you the story in St. Louis. A guy named Gary Franks. He's 31 years old. He had some problems with the law when he was growing up, but he put his life straight and he became a leader in his community, the owner of his own business, and he became a leader in Black Lives Matters because, as you know, Ferguson, Missouri was not far from St. Louis. So he decided to challenge a local incumbent state legislator. This is in 2016 for the office. She was over in her 70s. She'd been clearly gone out of gas, wasn't doing the job. So he challenged her, but she was part of the political machine. Her name was Hubbard. And the machine pulled out all the stops to save her. And so much so that on election day, of the people who voted in the polling places, Gary Franks won. But in the absentee ballots, there was an incredible surge in absentee ballots done through the mail. And he lost the ballots 80% to 20%. So he narrowly lost the election by a few votes. Well, the absentee ballots had been filled out so sloppily that this even attracted the attention of local election officials, and they investigated. A local judge said, "This election is completely compromised. We're going to have to rerun the election in 3 or 4 weeks." Same district, same candidates. So the election was held 3 or 4 weeks later. Gary Franks won 70% of the vote. Now, some of it was probably because of bad publicity about the fraud that had occurred in the race, but I think that just shows you the magnitude of the fraud that might have taken place. And he sits in the office today. He represents his district very well. I've spoken with him. And he says, if you think voter fraud doesn't happen, I lived through it. And if I hadn't had a good lawyer, I would have had that election stolen right out from under me.
Dakare, your turn.
Wow, this is very fascinating. I'm gonna make a joke because you know me, guys. This is really serious and fascinating, but I have to say this. So I think we should all just take our ballots, mail them to Cathy, and let Cathy FedEx them to the government. I'm positive they will be there in a day, because when Cathy tells me something's coming, it will be there that day. Okay.
Well, that does raise an interesting question. And, be honest here, you can raise your hands or otherwise indicated it. If you mail 100 letters, first-class letters through the U.S. Postal Service, how confident are you that all 100 will be delivered?
I'm not very confident unless Cathy's sending them through FedEx, and I promise you they'll be there.
Look, a close election, if you have 100 ballots sent out and only 98 or 99 are delivered, there are a lot of elections that are decided 51-49 or less. In fact, I know that Cathy's husband had such an election in Virginia a few years ago. It was very, very close. And if a bunch of ballots had been mailed and a few of them hadn't shown up, it could have made the difference in the entire election. So I don't think we want to, in one election, change all of the rules that we've been following for decades in this country and turn everything over to the United States Postal Office.
Well, I will say that everything, like I said, Cathy, I had to say that. She mails something, and I can promise you it'll be there when she says.
Well, Cathy is a model of efficiency and honesty, and if Cathy were running the election, I trust it completely. But not everyone is, some people are prone to human temptation.
So my question is this. So, with mail-in voting, what other countries are taking this up? Are we the only country that's like, oh, let's try mail-in voting? Are there any other countries, the UK, France?
That's an excellent question. We always are told that we should take lessons from other countries. For example, why don't we have a nationalized government-run healthcare system? Because most other countries have a form of that. With voting, nobody ever discusses this, but now that Britain has changed over, every country, industrialized country in the world, asks for ID at the polls. Half our states don't. So England, which is just starting this, Germany, France, Italy, Mexico has an extremely rigorous system. You have to dip your finger in ink to make sure that you don't get to vote twice. You have a hologram on your ID card. Every country asks people for ID at the polls, except for us, where half the states do and half the states don't. In addition, on mail-in voting, it's usually very restricted. It's basically for people who are traveling outside a district or old or frankly are sick. And it's not widespread. And in South Korea, which is only been a democracy for about 30 years, they had a parliamentary election in early April. And this is a country of 85 million people, and everyone voted. The turnout was higher than ever, and they voted at the polls, and they voted yes with masks and all of that. And it went very well, very smoothly. And we've also had elections that have gone smoothly here. But let's say Georgia, which just had an election, and it was chaotic because they switched over to all mail voting and people weren't used to it, and the election workers hadn't been trained properly. If you want chaos at the polls, change all the rules just before the election. You're going to get chaos. And you'll also get people arguing about who won the election for a long time to come.
Goodness gracious. I had an experience with FedEx this week where I sent a very important FedEx early morning delivery. I don't even want to know how much I had to pay for that, and it didn't get delivered. So, even FedEx can't even get it right all the time.
It's because you should have had Cathy do it. It's the touch.
I know. Cathy had sent it via FedEx. Cathy was actually trying to help figure out where it was because I called Cathy to help me. Okay, so Cathy, your turn.
Well, thank you, John. This has been fascinating, and we have got so many great audience questions. I thought we might run through just a couple. First of all, we've got Robert Summers, who is one of our listeners from Washington State. And Robert says, Washington State is a mail-in ballot state. What stories are there about fraud? I think he means in Washington State. And I was just wondering if Lisa could put up the map of just to show everyone which states, the pink states, I think are our 100% mail-in ballot states.
Pink is 100% vote by mail. The yellow is that you don't need an excuse. You can just request an absentee ballot. Anyone can. And then the purple is you still need an excuse, one of the state approved reasons.
But do you have any stories about Washington State?
Well, certainly Washington State in 2004 had one of the closest races for governor in American history. I think it was 132 votes separated the two candidates after 17 recounts. And that was before Washington State went to all mail voting. So mail voting played a factor. And there were lots of problems that were uncovered in the course of covering such a close race because, you know, we pay more scrutiny to such a race. And Seattle County, King County, which includes Seattle, constantly found more ballots all the time. It was like the magician pulling ballots out of a rabbit's hat. And it was amazing. It was just astonishing that I think it was 13 different times King County found more ballots. And the problem with mail balloting is if you have a box and you put the ballot in at the polling place, you're probably not going to lose a whole box. But if you have loose pieces of mail, small envelopes everywhere, I just worry that, you know, they'll be delivered a week after the election and the deadline will have been 5 days after the election. Do you count that ballot? This is an 24-hour, 7-day-a-week, 365 days a year open employment program for lawyers.
Thank you for that. And I think Mr. Summers appreciates that. I wanted to check, also Michael Amowitz asks, what progress has been made in updating voter lists nationwide? He says, I know it's generally sluggish, but I've heard there's been some success.
Yes, in fact, I can give you some good news. You know, the 2001 Help America Vote Act required the states to clean up their voter rolls, their voter registration lists, because an enormous number of Americans move. Of course, some sadly die. Also, some names just, you know, they don't exist. I mentioned God and Jesus in California. They do exist, but they don't exist on the voter registration rolls as legitimate voters. Los Angeles County in 2018 had 1.6 million inactive registrations. Almost 1/4 of all the registrations in the county. 1/4. They had not removed any inactive voters for 20 years, in complete violation of federal law, but the Justice Department never caught up with them. So Judicial Watch, which is I think one of 2 or 3 groups that are doing excellent work in this area, another being the Public Interest Legal Foundation, Judicial Watch sued Los Angeles and they did get a settlement. So they're finally going to clean the voter registration rolls. But this is common all over the country. North Carolina, 20% of the voter registrations aren't valid. This is a ticking time bomb because in a close election where interest is extremely high and partisan feelings run very, very deep, people sometimes are tempted. You know, the election is so important. My candidate has to win or the other candidate has to lose. And if you have a lot of inactive registrations, that's potential mischief just waiting to happen.
Cathy, did you want to ask something else or?
Well, we did. We also have our board member, Jay McConville, who's on tonight and watching. And Jay just had a question about voter ID and wondering if that isn't just totally invalidated if we go to all mail ballot.
No, it's not totally invalidated if we keep some of the ballot protections that some states have. There are some states that require you to put down your last few digits of your driver's license number or your social security number. That's an identifier, because if somebody has your ballot, they also would have to have your social security number, or they have to require a witness. Or there are a couple of states that you mail in a photocopy or a scan of your ID. That's uncommon, but that can be done. And the bill that Nancy Pelosi was pushing, and the activist groups that are pushing this around the country, want to get rid of all of those protections. So right now we do have protections against ballot fraud in mail voting, but not if the plans of some people become reality and those are taken away.
Okay, so I just want to clarify once again, because I think I stepped over you when you were talking. When you do a mail-in ballot, an absentee ballot, and you fill, I did this back in early 2000, but I can't remember. Does the envelope have your name, but does the actual ballot not have your actual name on it? There's no place you have to put your name on it, but then you have to put your social security on the ballot. So in other words,
well,
they take it out of the envelope.
It varies from state to state, but the common approach is your ballot has your name on it. The outside of the ballot, you have to sign it. You have to sign it both on the ballot and the outside of the ballot. And in theory, that's supposed to be matched with the signature that they have on file from when you registered to vote. But in practical terms, that's usually often not checked, or often checked in a very cursory fashion. So your ballot is not private.
Okay, all right, just want to clarify. And it seems to me if people can counterfeit money, they can certainly counterfeit an election ballot and make more of them, because you said many times, where all these ballots come?
Well,
where do they come?
No, it's not really, because you have to have the name, someone's name on the ballot. So it's much easier because our systems would be so sloppy if we went to all mail voting. There'd be millions of ballots sloshing around. I mean, you'd be able to get them. I mean, there was one case where an apartment building in Long Beach, California, somebody came home to their apartment, and you know how the mailboxes are outside the apartment building, and they're these, you turn the key and you get your mail. Well, on top was this giant stack of 87 ballots, absentee ballots that had been delivered to one address at the apartment building. They obviously didn't fit in the box, so somebody put them on top. And it turned out the widow who was there had never met or seen or known any of these people. Somebody had used their address as a mail drop to register a whole bunch of people. The ballots arrived, and clearly they were intending to go and pick up the ballots and take them and do something with them. It turned out that one guy happened to come just after the mailman had, and he found this stash. If he'd probably come a couple hours later, the stash would probably have been long gone.
Okay, so we're getting close to closing time here. I'd like to go back to that map, and then maybe Cathy and Tova can ask one last quick question. But if we go back to the map here, the pink states are all mail-in voting. And I guess obviously you have the choice you have the ballot at home, and you have a choice to do it at home, or you can go to the ballot box. That's what that means. When did they decide to do that? And then when we look at all, I think you said it goes back a couple of years. I'm wondering how much of this is COVID related. And you look at the yellow, which I believe is whatever, we don't have a graph telling us what everything means. But when did the pink, and most specifically the 4 pink states, do all? Is that recent? Because is this map correlating to any recent COVID decisions?
No, all of this is pre-COVID. The changes are being debated right now. That's why we're having this webinar. Oregon went to all mail balloting in 25 years ago. Washington State about 7 or 8 years ago. Colorado about 4 years ago. Utah is very new. Hawaii is very new. These are non-COVID related. There's been support for this for a long time. It's popular, but I'll just raise one other objection to all mail-in voting. Some of these states that have absentee ballots let you vote 6 weeks before the election. Why in the world do we have campaigns then if people can vote 6 weeks before an election, before the debates are even finished? Imagine that you were suing someone for cheating you, and you were suing them in court, and there was a jury, and the other guy gets up and has his lawyer speak, and then your lawyer gets up to speak, and halfway through, half the jury decides they've heard enough and just walks out. How would you feel? The reason we have a campaign is to convince people to vote a certain way or for a certain candidate. And if you have people voting before the debates, you're cutting off what is a legitimate public discussion about what direction the country or the state or the city should go. So I think this also changes the whole method and manner of the campaign. It also means more politicians spending more money because you have to spend on commercials and polling and everything else over a longer period of time rather than just aiming at a focal point of a single election day. So it actually makes bigger all of the things about politics we don't like: polls, consultants, and campaign commercials.
I definitely think that debates, they shouldn't, no one should vote until after the debates. Okay, so we have about 6 minutes left. Tova and Cathy, if you want to ask a final remaining quick question.
Sure. So we've talked a lot about a lot of the issues that are prevalent in the election, which has been so fascinating, by the way. But what concrete recommendations for protections that you think what ideas do you have for concrete protections that can be put in place to help prevent voter fraud and balance, as you said, on one hand, making it easy to vote and especially also safe to vote in this pandemic, but also making it hard to cheat?
Well, to follow my own prescription, it's probably too late to do anything dramatic, even if I like the idea, because I don't think you should make dramatic changes before this close to an election. But for future years, I'll say the following. I think ballot harvesting, allowing people who are not related to you or not someone who's very close to you and has your permission to go out and collect ballots and deliver them, is an open invitation to fraud. We should stop that. We should keep the protections we have now. We can have absentee voting and mail voting and early voting, but they should be a minority of the votes cast. The traditional method of voting on election day should be followed, because there are all kinds of reasons why we developed this system of voting on one day. All the campaigns are focused in their arguments on that one day. And there's something really stirring about the old Norman Rockwell tradition of everyone of all classes and all backgrounds and all peak types, meeting in one place for one day, every couple years. And in the long run, I think we can protect balloting with more voter integrity measures. And there's some things we could do. For example, I'm open to moving election day from Tuesday to a Saturday, a day when people aren't normally working. The reason we have a Tuesday election is based on our farming economy of 200 years ago, not today's realities. So there are things we can do to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat. But I'm simply arguing, let's not reinvent the wheel now just before a major and important election.
Well said. Very thought-provoking. Cathy.
Well, I think one thing we haven't talked about too much, but one of our listeners is asking about this, is online voting, voting by internet, because it seems that that's going to be a movement that people are going to start bringing up. Do you want to talk just a little bit about that? I see you cover your face with both hands.
No. The military tried to do this a few years ago. It was a disaster for overseas voters. If you want to have arguments about hacking and manipulating elections, look, there's a limit to what hacking can do in the current system. Let's say you have two voting machines in a polling place. They're not connected to each other. They're not connected to anything. They're standalone. If you want to change the votes, unless you have a very sophisticated software manipulation that, frankly, a lot of people would have to know about, and there's been no evidence of that, those machines would have to be broken into and hacked individually. That really does limit what you can do under the current system, and especially our decentralized system. But you go to internet voting, I leave it to the imagination of your extremely tech-savvy young audience as to what could go wrong.
Well, probably a lot. So.
Yeah, I'm not for online voting. Online, because as you say, talk about anybody could intervene from overseas if you had online voting. It would be
Well,
so easy because the internet's related connected all over the world.
Well, also not only that, but there something that would be called an error would suddenly change votes at the last minute. We've seen this in Bolivia, where the Central Election Board last year, they suddenly stopped counting for several hours, and when they came back, suddenly the votes were different, and one candidate won, and it led to a revolution, a violent revolution in the streets where people were killed, and the president had to flee the country because he was accused by the Organization of American States of committing voter fraud. You don't want to create a situation where there's potential anger and violence in an election. We've just gone through a situation where we had that and it wasn't pretty, and we don't want to do it again.
Right. Well, we didn't actually have it. They actually, what are you referring to?
We had some civil unrest recently.
We had what?
We had some civil unrest. Civil unrest.
Oh, civil unrest. Okay, I didn't know what you were talking about. I thought you were talking about we had some voter fraud. So I was like, wanted to clarify that.
Well, if we have voter fraud, I can guarantee you there'll be mad people on one side or the other, perhaps both sides, and they might get really mad.
I am a proponent for going back to all paper ballots at the ballot place. That's very old-fashioned to me, difficult. But I think
that's difficult.
If we were to go back to all paper ballots at the polling place, we wouldn't have to worry that the machines will, there's still the insinuation that even though they're standalone, as you said, people still think in their minds that an electronic vote at a polling place can be tampered. So
paper can be tampered with too. I got into this subject in college because I went to a recount of an election in California where I grew up, and I was the only witness there who watched the whole recount because I was doing it for my college paper, and it was paper ballots, and I saw voter fraud committed in front of my eyes. And people always say, well, why didn't you complain? And I said, well, it was the officials counting the votes who were doing the fraud. So the problem with our system doing all paper ballots are we have hundreds and hundreds of different ballots, dozens and dozens of races decided on a ballot. Most other countries vote for one or two things. They can easily do paper ballots. Electronic voting machines help the blind, help the people who have other language difficulties, because we have federal laws that require language compatibility and balloting. So I don't think we want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. If a state wants to use paper ballots, that's fine. But if a state wants to use sophisticated, state-of-the-art electronic machines like the teller machines you get your cash from, by the way, people trust those. How many of you keep the little paper receipt from the teller at the ATM every single time you get cash out? I doubt.
I do.
Well,
I do.
You're in the minority if you keep every single one of them.
I don't want to say that they took out $100 and I didn't really get my $100. Well, in closing, John Fund, this has just been brilliant. It's just been a fabulous discussion. I think we should do part 2 and do it again. And thank you so much. But in closing, why don't you talk about the fact of the integrity of our elections? We've talked a lot about this, a lot of fraud, a lot of this, that, but really we still have an election system and an election that's carried out every 2 to 4 and every 4 years that still has high integrity. Well, should we close on a high note with that? You want to comment on that a little bit?
We have elections with high integrity unless the election is viewed as being very, very close and there are people who are unscrupulous. So yes, most of our elections are free and honest and fair, but every election, there are people who have darkness in their heart, and they have ready cash, and they have the ability to reach out to people who are desperate. I have personally seen homeless people in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, paid off with packs of cigarettes to go in a van and be bussed from polling place to polling place and handed a slip of paper at each place saying, you're this person when you're voting in this spot. You'll be a different person in another spot. So yes, but Thomas Jefferson warned us, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. We have a good system. We have a largely honest and fair system. but we have to, every election, be on guard that, especially when it's viewed as close and especially when partisan feelings run very high, that's when we need the safeguards and we need to be on guard, because the last thing we want is an election like Florida 2000, where people argued about it and still are arguing about it to this day, about what was legitimate and what was fair.
The Electoral College really helps that. We've had a discussion on this show about how that prevents, how really prevents voter fraud, because the Electoral College, there's so much fraud that can be done. Yeah, so much fraud can be done. But I mean, you know, we have a vigilant system, and if we cannot believe that our elections are fair, we're in trouble. So I think that we should. It's good for us to recount that in America we have vigilance. Yes, we're humans. All, you know, what is it? James Madison said, "Men are not angels." But it still, on the whole, as my mother likes to say, we have very honest elections, and if we lose that belief, as my daughter comments quite often, we're in trouble as a country. But because that's the beauty, is that we've been able to accept that whoever's elected has been fairly elected. So I think that it's the heart of our. It's important that we do have vigilant, and we do have.
The heart of our system is the peaceful, orderly transfer of power. And we were the first country in the world to develop a constitution that provided for that, which is why I'm so glad and happy that you and Cathy and your team are reminding people of the importance of our Constitution and the need for us to follow it.
And to vote and to be vigilant as well, but to know that we do have amazing, honest elections here. Okay. Thank you, John Fund. Thank you so much. That was really, really, really great. Time is so short, but it was an hour of your time, and we appreciate the fact that you took this time with us this evening and taught us so many intricacies of what's going on out there. And I think it certainly makes us aware of how we should be vigilant, to say that again, because I just said it a minute ago. But anyway, thank you, John Fund, so much. Thank you. Okay, so we have some closing remarks. Do you have anything you'd like to say, Mr. Fund, in closing? And to go check out your books again, or a website, or anything? Your National Review Online.
If anyone wants more information on this subject, they can go to the Heritage Foundation's website. Just type in the search box voter fraud. They can also go to the Public Interest Legal Foundation, PLIF.org. And there'll be lots of information that on both the sites on the subjects we discussed. And again, thank you. And to all of the young people out there, good luck with your futures.
Thank you. Can I ask one last question? You don't think that they're going to do a mail-in vote this late, do you?
Some
federal
states,
government, they can't really get that done.
Some states are moving towards it. And it's a concern. That's why I'm doing this webinar. That's why I'm writing the things I'm writing and appearing on television. It's a danger, because some states, the one party controls both the governor's office and both houses of the legislature, so it can happen very quickly. Okay, well, thank you for educating us about this, and maybe we'll keep watching you out there with all the great public appearances that you do and your wonderful writings about this. And thank you so much, Jonathan.